Good morning and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion with Jump. And this week's discussion, we're looking at team behavioural profiling and how to build a stronger team or create another service offering. This week, I'm joined by Christian Hughes, the founder of My People. And before I introduce Christian, I'll sort of give you some stats that I've pulled out as always. 80% of the Fortune 500 companies use personality tests to vet their upper level positions. 82% of companies are currently using some form of pre-employment tests for their recruitment process. 35% of recruiters believe that soft skills assessments will shape the recruitment industry in the next decade. And recruitment managers who utilize pre-hiring assessments in their recruitment process have reported a 30% more satisfaction with their final decision than those that don't. Businesses that have seen a 24% reduction in their attrition by using profiling. And the British Psychology have done some research into assessment types, and they've said that the percentage uplift of success from assessment centres using profiling is 37%. Unstructured interviews is 38%, and team behavioural profiling gives you a 67% uplift. So it's a real sort of big position to move forward. 50% of up to 50% improvement in candidate engagement through the interview process was generated via reports from My People, and 98% completion rate of their candidate profiling. So a real big completion rate of assessments, which takes between 6 to 8 minutes, which is again by My People, which is Christian's company. So welcome, Christian. Thank you for joining us.
To be here. Thank you.
Just to give Christian a quick introduction, Christian formed the business in 2014 with a group of analysts, psychologists, and data scientists that support some of British greatest sporting teams. And I'm sure we're going to hear quite a lot about that today. So they specialize in measuring the environmental, behavioral, and psychological factors that affect teams. So your team in the business and also the teams that you're recruiting for your clients. So Christian, let's sort of throw in there, and I'm sure you're going to bring out some sort of DNA from the companies that you've worked for, like British Cycling, rowing, England rugby teams, Premiership football teams, and things like that. So thank you for bringing your expertise to us. So I'm going to open up with a question is, what is team behavioural profiling and how can it be implemented into the recruitment process?
So firstly, thank you very much for having me on here. It's lovely to be here, and it's lovely to have the opportunity to talk about some of these things, because I think they're fascinating, and especially in the recruitment market where we can get very focused on the practical delivery of candidates into roles. Some of the background as to whether they're going to be successful in that role can easily get lost in the desire to make a placement. So I think for those people listening, this should be really interesting stuff, especially when we think about it in the context of coming from sport. So I've been very fortunate to work with a variety of different sporting teams. And one of the key pieces that's been learnt on that sort of 20-year journey was and I'm not just isolating specific teams here, this was across all of the different sporting teams I worked on, we were very good at measuring the individual. So we would be brilliant at understanding the biology of the individual and making them stronger, faster, better. That's pretty much a given within sport. What we were bad at was understanding whether they could execute on their capabilities, that biological brilliance in our team. And I suppose we didn't think the environment within which they were going to be performing was a factor in whether they would perform or not. And if you think about it in business terms, we constantly, through an interview process, are assessing competence. We're looking at, can this individual do the job? And that's right, because that is a primary question. The secondary question should be, can they do the job here? And at the moment, that's done through gut feel, the recruiter's knowledge of that specific customer. And in many cases, that's very cold. You know, if you're a recruiter who doesn't have a strong relationship with the existing group of people where you're going to be placing the candidate, you're really making a guess based on the organization. So team behavioral profiling is a concept that's come out of sport and is a way of understanding an individual in the context of the team they're going to be working in. And what we found in sport is that is the activator of an individual's competence.
It's a really interesting comment because last week we were talking about how developing skills, and again on Friday I'm down delivering a conversation which Dave is as well, a presentation to the Teams Network, and one of that conversation is about execution and strategy, and how is your strategy right, and therefore how do people execute that strategy, and therefore playing that behavioural profiling into people to be able to deliver the strategy that you've got is really important. So when you look at that from a recruitment process, when you're building that into a recruitment process, what does that look like? Because that first question there is a really sort of triggers me straight away that have I got the right people in the right place, but also have I got the right strategy?
Absolutely. So within the context of a recruitment process, this has been one of the sort of pain points for us through the years. And I'm not going to use this as an agony aunt session, but the generations coming through now are used to very speedy interactions. Their attention spans are less. I don't mean that as a criticism. I just mean there's now a lot more information coming their way. So as a consequence of that, we needed to do this quickly. So a traditional approach when we're profiling would be somewhere between 20 and 50 minutes for a candidate. That's impossible nowadays to implement that within a recruitment process. So what we've done is get it down to 6 minutes for a candidate. So they can do an online survey and within 6 minutes have a good understanding of their personality and how that will relate to the role they're doing, and a good understanding of the team they're going to be going into and how they're what they need to be able to perform within a team, whether that's in existence in the team they're going into. We also take a brief measurement of the existing team, which is a sort of 5-6 minute thing that a hiring manager will complete. So the upshot of that is for a hiring manager, you get a good understanding of what's our environment like, what's it like to work in our team across 13 core factors, which I'll touch on a bit later. And for the candidate, they get that piece of insight to say, well, what do I need? When you think about describing to somebody what do you need in a team to perform, it's a very hard question to answer. And we probably grasp at it as a candidate. This gives some meaningful data to them.
Okay, so let's move that on then. So what are some of the key behavioural traits to look for when building a high performing team, and how can these be assessed in the recruitment process?
Yeah, good question. So there's a couple of different things that I could talk about generically. What we have come to understand in the different organizations we worked with, and I think of, say, Saracens as a good example of this versus some of the other rugby clubs out there. When we were working with Saracens, they had this concept of called social capital. Now, this might not be relevant in other teams, but it's a good way of illustrating how different teams are slightly different and different things get emphasized. We think of the environment as something that switches on or switches off behavior. If you think of it in, say, a recruitment business, what you reward, what you recognize becomes the behaviors you generate within the business, and what you give limited attention to becomes the facets that don't happen very often within your business. Within Saracens, they had this concept of social capital, which was the idea that anybody coming into this team has to connect with the existing group. And so they had a load of activities to drive this approach. So, for example, at team meetings on a weekly basis, someone would stand up and give a 5 minute, and it was maximized at 5 minutes before the session started, presentation on something of interest to them. Now, I would imagine, especially where I started with this concept, I would imagine there's a lot of people listening to that thinking, what? How does that help? Well, what that drove was getting to know people in the group, what was important to people, what they were interested in, and then building relationships off the back of that. And we might still say, well, why does that matter? Well, if you think about how you interact with your CFO, your sales director, the moderator in difficult situations is your relationship with that person. If you imagine having a conversation with somebody important within your business and you don't get on, when there are breakdowns in the communication around budgets or something, that relationship is the moderator of whether you can communicate to them, how to phrase things to them. And so what we found through that sort of social capital idea within Saracens was the soft skills, the things that perhaps we would give less importance to in business, are actually the things that glue together and make conversations work, make budgeting processes more easy. So it's, as a general answer, I'd say we're looking for a combination of ability to connect with the existing team, interest in other people. I can talk about sort of results orientated, outcome orientated thinkers, and that is clearly a big part of being successful in a sort of sales or marketing led role where you're externally orientated. But one of the sort of social capital concepts of Saracens is that how you relate to people is critical in every single role, maybe less critical in some independent individual roles. So I'd put much more emphasis on that than I would have 20 years ago.
If we look at that from a recruitment point of view, and on here we've got people who are small recruitment agencies right up to large recruitment agencies, you start to think about that, and I think about that from a training point of view for managers. Understanding your social capital, as you describe it, is understanding the motivators of the people, understanding their outside interests, understanding them as a person rather than understanding them as a billing machine. Is that where you're talking to? Because as we've discussed in the past, I played elite sport, and we weren't talking about our social capacity or capital. What we had is a really good team bond. But when you actually break it down, it's because everyone knew everybody, went out with everybody, we integrated with everybody, and it was interesting. We constantly had people arriving every Tuesdays and Wednesdays to trial and training sessions, and half of that was about how they integrated with us, whether they talked with us, etc. And it was a really interesting. It's interesting that Saracens are using that as social capital. We just use that as is it somebody we want to go for a beer with? Is it someone we want to understand from that point of view?
100%. And I'd go as far from a data perspective as saying their social capital scores and team cohesion, which is another metric that's evolved from that, predict performance. There's a couple of other metrics they use, but when they have, for example, a group of people on the pitch where the combinations, the key communication combinations, the centers or the fly half and the number 8, where they haven't spent a lot of time together, that contributes to a lower score in terms of team cohesion, which they then utilize as predicting whether they've got enough cohesion on the pitch to take decisions, and they relate it back to decision making. So I think it's one of those indirect factors, team bonding, social capital, that influence how people communicate, whether they can communicate, and whether they can take decisions together. And to your point about going for beers, one of the huge advantages sports has that perhaps we don't have in business is there's a shared purpose. There's a weekly sort of cadence and rhythm around performance, because every Saturday or Sunday you're playing a game. And it's a bit like the military or sort of medical, in that you get a banter going because you have to perform all the time. And there's sort of this black humor that generates in a lot of these environments because of the pressure to perform is on all the time. In business, we don't have quite the same luxury when it comes to building cohesive teams, because not everyone's got the same motivations, to your point earlier. So then it's about, how do you create opportunities to understand other people's motivations? How do you create opportunities to bond? Sometimes that's, going over a beer, but in remote working scenarios, that's less easy. So creating opportunities where people can connect might seem arbitrary and not that important in the practical delivery of billing, but actually it's mission critical to decision making, communication.
Which goes back to strategy and execution. If you're not communicating that properly and fluidly across the business, and that communication isn't going both ways, then that becomes a blocker in both the strategy and the execution of that strategy. And the Harvard Business Review that I read the other week on this was giving it that 63% of all financial targets, only 63% of all financial targets are hit because either the strategy isn't right or the execution isn't right. But in the middle of it is because the communication across all of it is poor.
Absolutely. I mean, I probably shouldn't say this out loud, and I'm sorry to keep talking about rugby, but a number of the analysts that I've worked with in England rugby, Welsh rugby, Scottish rugby believe you could share the tactical game plan with the opposing team and it would make no difference to the outcome. There's a sort of shared belief amongst the analysts that is the team that executes best on the day wins. And of course, if you have people who are more capable and more able to execute regularly, you're going to win more often. But the sort of shared belief that we have is it's less about out and out tactics. It's about how well you execute those tactics.
Because that's a really interesting. Sorry, Dave. We had a 12-3 rule and it was all about the communication. And it was all about if your 12 on the day outperformed their 12, then you would win. So you could afford to have three carriers. Okay. But as soon as you went to 11-4, it dropped the percentage chance of winning. As soon as you got to 10-5, you were losing. And it was really interesting that that was all about the communication on the pitch and what was talking about and how people work. And could you outperform your opposition and therefore be part of the 12 rather than part of the three? It was a real.
We used to have games from an analytical perspective, and are now slightly veering away from profiling and coming to performance analysis, where you look on the pitch as the analysts and you think it is so blindingly obvious where the space is, where they need to play, how they should be executing, but it's not happening on the pitch. And then you'd have these debrief sessions, sort of cold and hot debrief sessions, and the players would say, yeah, so and so would say, oh yeah, I kind of saw that the space was over there on the right wing, or that their fullback was playing over here, and we should have been executing, doing X, Y, Z, without getting too technical. And we'd say, well, why didn't other people know that? And always the forwards to say, well, we're buried on the floor, so what the hell do we know? And so then it was like, well, how are we communicating and recognizing problems when they arise? So this was the start. I'm going back a good 10, 15 years now. This was the start of sort of scenario identification, as we called it. So if it's a bad ball from the back of a ruck, sorry to keep going on about rugby, what do we play off? How do we identify that? What's the call to adapt the way we're going to execute? And it's back to your point. It's the identification of problems clearly, and then the communication of that problem, and then the execution of a solution. Being able to do that rapidly is actually comes back to soft skills.
And that goes back to how well you execute the strategy, and does the strategy actually work, even though it's been executed? And therefore, does the strategy change, or does the execution stay? Dave, you were going to say something, and I sort of.
I was just going to ask a kind of side question, Christian. In your experience with the recruitment, a lot of recruitment leaders are very individual focused. They want individuals to perform well, and if they do, then the company does well. Do you find them to be less tolerant about a team performance than, say, people in sports?
Yes, because it comes back to belief and fear for me around this specific topic. If you have a high biller and I can't swear on here, can I? They are not the best behaved individual, which is probably a very common scenario.
Yeah.
The fear as the leader is, well, they're a high biller, and that's the beginning and end of them as a person. So I don't want to do anything to affect that because it's critical to my cash flow and the business growth. The problem, of course, is not the immediate problem of their behavior. It becomes the secondary problem as you try to scale, because everybody that comes into that organization, whether they realize they're doing it or not, recognizes that good performer, the behaviors required to be that good performer are what are copied. And so the arsehole behavior, as I'd call it, starts to become more. And so then you get this sort of suppression pattern that occurs where the highest billers are performing well, but they're doing it at the expense of everybody else. And so what we've found in sport, and Liverpool's a great example of this, is if you can get that team ethos and team buy-in happening early as you're growing your business, it enables other people to perform more often. When you've got ones and twos in your business, the individual performers, it might not be as obvious that sometimes the bad behavior is driving a poor culture. Once you've got sort of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people in the business, it becomes more problematic because everybody's copying what they perceive as the good high achievers behavior. So within the likes of Liverpool, for example, they do a huge amount of research to make sure that people coming in buy into the way we operate here, which is communication, team ethos first. I mean, it's a perennial problem, right? Individual versus team, but those that succeed and scale are the ones that can get their heads around how to activate the team.
Okay. So then how can team profiling then improve the overall hiring process and help identify the best candidates for the role and the team?
So team profiling enables you to understand what is my team like, what does it need, and then adapt as you bring people into the organization, identify how they're going to contribute to your group. So you can kind of build that dream team. I don't know whether any of you guys watch Clarkson's Farm. And I'm
Yeah.
not into gardening at all, so it's quite far removed, and farming, it's quite far removed from my normal sort of analogies. But there's something that struck out that was similar to what I'd experienced in sport, related back to team profiling, which was they were growing in the ground a number of different varieties of seeds at the same time, because the view was this would generate, instead of single seeds, which is the traditional approach, this would generate seeds, plants that would work better together and grow better together because they're performing different roles. Exactly the same principle we found in sport. Having a Harry Kane, for example, or one person who's your best player on the pitch, means that everybody passes the ball to that individual, and the team shape and the team's overall structure disappears. You're entirely reliant on that individual performing time and time again, which they can't do because people always run out of steam. So team profiling helps by understanding, what have you got, what do you need in order to build this team into something that is cohesive, whether that's for your clients or whether that's for you.
So what you're saying then is that if you can then identify the traits of what good looks like, and then you recruit around those traits and those those behaviors, then that is where your starting point is to building a high performing team.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an ongoing process. Unfortunately, all of us, especially me, would love to believe, I've got my own team, would love to believe you get the right people in the room and that's the end of the story. But unfortunately, it's an annoying part of that process is the constant evolution of that group, and it changes and needs different things at different times and different phases. But yeah, the starting point is understanding, what are we against some key metrics that we have? What will we need to evolve this team?
So let's push that into the next question then, because why do you align behaviors, or why do aligning behaviors help to create high performing environments then?
So it's a bit like your point around strategy. If you don't know where you're going, any road will do. I believe it's an Alice in Wonderland quote. The same sort of principle applies. If you don't know what you are, and I don't mean that in a conceptual sense, I mean that in a practical, how are we actually communicating, how are we servicing our customers? If you don't understand your group, and you're effectively saying anybody can succeed here, and that unfortunately is not the case. You're going to find that it's going to take you a lot of time. If you look at Premiership football teams now, especially the top teams, very rarely do new hires, I was going to call them, but players that they buy fail. You look at where we were 10 years ago, and there was constant failure, and the reason for that is there was little definition around each club, and players coming in were not heavily researched around whether they fit in here. They were researched purely around skills and capabilities. And I think we do the same thing within business. So aligning behaviors is not getting people all the same. In fact, it's almost the opposite. It's what we would call connect and contribute. You want people to have some sort of sense of belonging here, and why is it unique to be here? Otherwise, they could be anywhere. And you want to have a sense of how they're going to contribute to this group to evolve it.
So that's an interesting conversation about contribution. And therefore, that goes back into a strategy that if everybody knows where they're going and how they contribute to the overall strategy, therefore it makes execution of that strategy easier, and they should be able to identify where there's pressure on that strategy or pressure on the execution, but also where performance is high and performance is low. And therefore, what you're saying about having different people, it's having that creative person, that doer, that thinker, the challenger, etc., etc. But having all those people rather than having just a carbon copy of one type of person.
Yeah, I mean that's that's the traditional logic, isn't it? If you had one high biller, for example, I know we're focusing quite a lot on recruiters. Probably for all of us, we'd say, well, we should go and find another Adam, another Sarah, because they're doing well here. That logic seems to stand, but it doesn't play out in reality. The actual reality is, and I can think of one organization recently which we profiled where I think about 50 odd people, and we looked at their sort of top 10 high performers. Every single one of them was different, and yet the role is exactly the same. And I think what echoed from my past is, you can do most roles in many different ways. it's more about the characteristics of the individual and the characteristics of the team.
Okay. So how does team behavioural profiling help to build a more productive team then, considering what you just said? And obviously, can you share examples of that? Because what you just said is quite an interesting conversation about, you could take your top 10 billers, they're all different. They all have nothing in common to a certain degree, but they have a collective that makes them pull together and work together.
We had I may as well stick with that same example. This organization was having a couple of different challenges. One was around attrition. They were bringing in sort of junior staff who were leaving quite quickly. They had different sort of service sectors doing well, but it was very cyclical, and they wanted to build a more consistent revenue line. That was sort of the gist of how we found them. And so their starting point was, can we profile our top 10 high performers? When we were profiling them, although they were entirely different, there was a sort of service excellence facet that came through. And what I mean by that was, for one person, one of their high billers, it was all about the results. Their personality and their reason for being there was that sense of success that they got from delivering the result. At the other end of the spectrum, we had an individual who it was all about their customer loving them, the sense of warmth and job well done satisfaction they got from the customer marking their service highly. So the problem they were having as a group was, one was saying, well, it's all about service, and this is coming back to my point of communication, and at the other end, another individual saying, well, it's all about results. What we were able to show through the team profiling was, you're talking about the same thing, you're just doing it in a different way. You're both executing and getting results, and you're both highly motivated, and that was a consistent theme across, almost psychotically motivated, these 10 high performers, but by different things. But when you sort of glued it together at the top, it was the same outcomes they were driving. So we were able to create a profile of them, which sort of was at a higher level, really, was less about whether you're results orientated or service orientated, which was their conundrum. And actually, it was a higher level of its satisfaction sort of position that they wanted to obtain with their clients, where their clients thought they were doing a brilliant job, and that was their ultimate marker. And we could then create a behavioral profile for their team that allowed us to hire different people, but they had the same purpose and outlook. And the end result of that was their attrition problem dropped away. They were much more specific about how they were hiring and who they were hiring, and they've now got a very diverse team, but they're all psychotically interested in the customer output.
So if you looked at that then from a productivity from the recruitment team, just taking that question, sort of pushing it the other way, if you're looking at pushing that into their end client base as a service offering, how does behavioral profiling then help you create a productive team for your end client? Because obviously that's the ultimate goal, isn't it? That our end client uses us exclusively, etc., etc. How do you use that to help them identify the same things in the end client, when the end client's usually quite standoffish about letting you sort of getting into the cultural behaviour of the business?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two levers that we use are talent activation and retention. There's no point placing someone if they're going to bounce. To give you a sort of a story, perhaps before I answer in full, one of the nice examples of this is Liverpool Football Club between, say, 2010 and 2015, 16. And they were going on a recruitment drive, which was about skills. And they wanted to be a more technically orientated team with better footballing skills. So they went to the Spanish market and bought a load of Spanish players who did not succeed at Liverpool, and it cost them a fortune. Now, the reason why they didn't succeed was the physical attributes. The Spanish league is entirely different in terms of the physical environment to the Premier League in England. And so I think it's a nice example of, if you are not concentrating on the environment within which you're placing people, there is a a real possibility that these people won't perform, or worse, they'll just be unhappy and leave. So for a client, this is about whether someone will perform, speed to productivity, and retention. You've got to think beyond whether someone can do the job and think about whether they can do it here at this specific client in this specific team. And I think we found in our work, I mean, we're doing probably in the region of 12,000 assessments a month, at about a 96, 97% completion rate. Most clients will invest 6 minutes as a hiring manager to have some reassurance, some insurance that the person they're going to get is going to stay and is going to get up to productivity quickly. And to give you one further example, call centers. We've done quite a lot of work with call centers, banking, insurance call centers throughout the world. And one of the amazing stats is that you don't get your return on investment traditionally on a call center hire for 5 months. So if someone leaves before 5 months, you don't get your investment cost of hiring them, the training cost of getting them up to speed, and the general industry point at which people leave is 4.5 months. So it's something crazy. I don't have the stat to hand. Something like 90% of call centers, you don't get the return on investment of hire. So in this circumstance, we're able to say, well, a lot of that is because you don't understand your own environment, what it's actually like to work here, and you're not prepping the candidate to get ready for that. And so what we're able to say for those types of businesses is the candidate will stay for 9 months. We can guarantee a 6 to 9 month position, so you'll get your return on investment through taking this approach.
What we're saying then is, your speed of productivity is that conversation about hitting break-even point, but then it's about, for the client's point of view, it's then, if you looked at the average tenure of somebody within a business, and let's say the average tenure is 18 months, if you can improve by recruiting better people that are more culture aligned and team aligned, then they're likely to stay longer, and therefore it reduces their overall cost of recruitment. But to do that, you've got to take a measure of what the behavioural traits of that culture and the cultural traits of that team are, so you can then see how each individual that you're putting to them fits into that measure. Is that
exactly right? I mean, if we took a recruiter, you'll know the stats better than me here, but I certainly within a lot of the businesses I've worked in with sales orientated people, you don't really get your return on investment, their salary investment and time investment for, let's say, 9 months minimum. Is that fair? Before they're becoming a reasonable biller. Is that fair?
I would say that they probably hit the break-even point consistently at about 9 months. But then to actually get your money back and your return on investment, you're probably looking at anywhere between 12 and 18 months, depending on whether it's contract, perm, or temp, or whatever the market they're in. But you'd probably say between 6 and 9 to get to hit them consistently hitting their monthly break-even point, but probably 12 to 18 for you to actually have a complete return on your investment.
And presumably there's, again, I don't know this empirically as you will, there's probably other markers, like when their first deal is likely to be, and maybe that's within the first 6-8 weeks you're looking for a first deal. There might be a secondary marker, which is to have opened up X amount of opportunities. I don't know the stats well enough, but the question becomes, how do I make that more likely? And one of the ways of making that more likely, that they hit their markers and get those markers earlier, and therefore you get your return on investment earlier, is understanding the individual and understanding your environment and being more selective. Well, how do you do that? At the moment, that's gut feel. It's, have you got any mates who would be interested? We're far too slack about this because we take a short-term position where we think, well, if we get the bodies in, some will make it and some won't. And all the costs are hidden. You're kind of sitting there as a business owner, not recognizing that it's costing you time, money every time you go through this hiring process. And if your selection rate was 80, 90% chance of these people being successful and hitting the ROIs earlier, your business will be more successful more quickly. And the same applies for clients.
It's quite interesting. There's a couple of people on the webinar today that has gone through some of my training promos of where they worked for me in different businesses. And my comment was never about the first deal. I wasn't bothered about when you made the first deal. that was about the consistency of the second, third, and fourth deal. So again, if I could understand what behavior traits and how the culture enables people to hit that second, third, and fourth deal within a better time as your speed to productivity, then it gives me a far better understanding whether that person's going to be successful. Because I think in recruitment, you can be lucky to hit one client and find one candidate that hits that client and make that first deal. But can you do that consistently? And I think that is about the culture, the training, the behaviors that you install in people from there. So how could a team offering behavioural profiling become a sort of game changer for agencies and their clients?
Well, I mean, speaking frankly, the challenge agencies have is how do you differentiate your offering? Some have gone down the productization route. Some leverage their market knowledge and industry knowledge. We work with a couple of companies who work with private equity businesses, and they have this perennial problem where one of their higher billers builds some relationships with a specific private equity firm and then leaves and sets up their own agency. So what was a marketplace where there's only 2 or 3 big providers suddenly becomes proliferated where there's 20, 30, 40 providers based off one initial client relationship. And so the problem I think that recruitment agencies, RPOs have is how do we make ourselves different and how do we make ourselves sticky? And I think what this can offer is the ability to take a more consultative approach with clients, to be able to say this comes from sport. This enables people to stay within your organization, thrive and perform. And so instead of taking a short-term, the perception, of course, of recruitment businesses can be, we're placing bodies. Actually, this is a more consultative delivery approach with a client saying this is about getting people in, but we don't stop there. We then want to know that they're going to be able to perform, and this is a unique way of doing that in a quick time frame.
Okay, so when you start to think about then tailoring that service to a client, a lot of our clients, a lot of the recruitment agencies that we deal with, feel that this is a big leap of faith for their end clients to move across that. It's also a big leap of faith for them to do it for their own businesses. So how do you get our agencies first and all to take that leap of faith for themselves, but also then enable them to sell to their clients to take that leap of faith?
Yeah, good question. A lot of this comes down to results and experiencing it for yourself. So there is a degree of a leap of faith. I understand that, but we've probably got 70 or 80 customers that we now work with from a standing start, sort of a couple of years back. And the results are incredible. We're seeing sort of 24 to 30% uplift in retention on placed candidates. And when you roll that through, it's a real monetary difference. We're hearing stories, I think that the stats are coming out at about 20% uplift in retainers won. And I think one of the reasons for that is that a traditional, I mean, you guys are brilliant at this, at helping people really differentiate what their retained offering is from their contingent offering and being very selective about which customers they work with. But traditionally, retained work has not really had any difference to a contingent offering for many companies. And so this can be part of that as a consultative process to understand a client. That information is fed back to the client instantly. And so this discussion point becomes, here's what we're seeing in your team. Does that feel about right? Here's the sort of candidates that are going to be able to impact that team. And it becomes a much broader conversation rather than have they got this skill? Have they got that skill? It becomes a more holistic conversation and builds trust downstream. So I understand there's a bit of a leap of faith, but from my perspective, this is where the market is moving. And we deal with, I'd say 40% of our customer base is enterprise businesses over 1,000 employees. So we're dealing with TA teams, HRDs and CPOs all the time. And there's sort of a relief of, finally, we can get this information quickly. We've been asking for this for years, but everybody tells us it's not available.
And does it work, Christian, because a lot of recruitment companies have got less than 10 people?
Yep.
Yeah, and some of the clients are small as well. Does it work? Is it equally as powerful?
Yeah, so it doesn't matter the size. Anywhere from sort of 5 people upwards, we can get a culture or a team environment. So we can measure that. Okay. It's all anonymous as well, so you don't get to see an individual's response. You get to see what the the overall environment is like. We've got a range of different methodologies which allow you to do an express version, which is just with the hiring manager. We can also do a wider team. We've got a leadership version where we can, the problem we had with exec search companies coming to us saying the client's asking for something on impact. When you're hiring a exec leader, there's always some degree of transformation required in that role. It's sort of implicit in the fact that we're hiring a sales director or a new marketing director. We can tell whether someone's got the skills and experience. That's not the hard bit. What we can't tell is what are they going to be like with our board? What are they going to be like with the team they're working with? So we evolved a specific product to be able to do that for clients. So there's lots of different entry points. We do volume hiring, call center hiring, sort of mid-market, and then senior. So it's all covered. It all can be branded in clients' branding. So it's nice and easy to get going.
Let's challenge you on the last question then. What would you recommend then as an elevator pitch to introduce the values of team behavioural profiling to a client?
So the phrase we use is talent activation through team dynamics. What does that mean? Skills and experience are relatively easy to assess. Whether someone will perform an environment is unknown. We allow that to be known.
So what you're saying is then by doing that process, you can start to identify for a client where they may have multiple environments within one large environment. You could be able to identify which environment is a high productive environment, which environment is a toxic environment, which environment is going either one way or the other. So you'll be able to identify that and able to change a client's, I suppose, profile or demographic with regards to the culture of the environment to ensure that you're not poisoning the well.
Exactly right. And I suspect for the people on this webinar, for you guys, you'll know not every client is going to buy into this. And that's not what we're saying. I don't think, sometimes it's a blanket approach across all clients, and a customer, a recruitment customer of ours is using it with their client base, and it's all clients. But more often than not, it's selective. It's either through retained projects, it's senior work, or it's identifying customers, one or two, that have more interest in this. And being pragmatic, the sports background and its origin is quite helpful in that regard, because it might be traditionally thought, people don't necessarily think about the sort of team profiling piece. That might be thought of as less important than skills and experience. What we found in sport, which is an environment where if an idea is not good, it gets killed really quickly, because you see it on the pitch. If an idea is good, it really gets traction quickly. That's the great proof point environment that sport is. What we found is once people start to get their heads around this, it's actually the critical factor that enables someone to perform. And so it's not good enough to think of, it is one way of thinking of it is you're looking at skills and experience in a vacuum. If you're not doing this, you're blind as to whether someone is going to be able to execute on those skills and experience.
What you're actually saying is that you could bring the person in that's got the best skills and the best experience. However, if it doesn't hit the cultural environment, it's likelihood that skills and experience will fail.
Absolutely right. If you take Ronaldo, I know he was at the back end of his career when he joined Manchester United. But why did that not work out? It became a toxic environment for a number of different reasons, but critically because of him, tactically because of what they were trying to do. What people don't see from behind the scenes is there was a sort of toxicity that came with that, and a deference to Ronaldo in that team, which happens every day in recruitment companies and in sales teams and in high performing teams, whereby one person completely disrupts the whole unit. Well, through this approach, you would know that in advance.
So it's a really interesting conversation, Christian. I think we could talk for hours and hours about it, especially sort of linking it back into sport and then putting it into a business point of view. It's been enlightening to me, and I've been in behavioural recruitment for quite some time and sort of done lots of it. But again, it sort of highlighted things to me that how you can improve your sale, how you can improve your culture, that improves the how you can improve the optimization of your team. And I think that's the way I look at it. It's about optimizing everything within your team, and the thing that you've got to optimize most is the culture around everybody that's in there. And therefore, if you get that right, then everything else doesn't just fall into place. You've got to work to make it fall into place, but it helps things to fall into place. So that's great. So Christian, thank you very much. Dave, thanks for your input. Ladies and gents, that's it for this week. Thank you very much. Next week, we're going to move on to talk about putting a 90-day plan into place, because at the moment we think as we start to come out and the market starts to lift again, it's about what you're going to do in the next 90 days to really help you finish off 2024 on a high note. So once again, Christian, thanks very much. Ladies and gents, thanks for your time. We'll look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.